My name is Grace Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've worked in operations, one of those departments people rarely notice unless something goes wrong. If you ask my coworkers to describe me, they'd probably say the same things: calm, dependable, easy to work with. The kind of person who keeps things organized, the one who remembers how processes actually work when everyone else forgets. None of those descriptions is wrong, but they're incomplete. What people often mean when they say those things, though they rarely say it directly, is that I'm safe, predictable, quiet enough not to challenge the room, the person who will stay late to finish the report, the person who will fix the spreadsheet someone else broke, the person who will train the new hire, even if that new hire technically outranks her. For 3 years, I did the work of a team lead without the title. I coordinated projects, solved problems before they reached management, and kept the department running smoothly when things got messy, which, in operations, is almost always. My manager knew it, the team knew it, even clients knew it. So when the team lead position finally opened, most people assumed the same thing I did, that the role would simply become official. Instead, I was called into a meeting one Friday afternoon and told the company had decided to go with someone who had more potential. That someone arrived the following Monday morning. He walked straight to my desk, introduced himself with an easy smile, and asked if I could show him how the job worked, because he'd never done it before. Later, I learned something else about him. He wasn't just a new hire, he was my manager's nephew. Now, if this were a different kind of story, this is where the anger would start. Maybe the confrontation, maybe the dramatic moment where someone flips a table or storms into HR. But that's not what happened. This story isn't about revenge, and it isn't about dramatic victories. It's about something quieter than that. About what happens when someone who has spent years being overlooked decides, without raising their voice, to stop playing the role everyone expects. What changed everything wasn't the promotion I didn't get. It was the moment I realized exactly what people believed about me and how wrong they were. The interesting part is that nobody noticed the shift when it happened. Not my manager, not his nephew, not even most of my coworkers. At least, not at first. By the time they understood what had really been happening, the situation had already moved far beyond anyone's ability to fix it. But to explain how that happened, I have to start with something much smaller. Not the meeting, not the promotion, just the quiet role I had been playing for years without questioning it. Because before anything changed, I was exemplary the person they believed me to be. Have you ever realized that people had quietly decided who you were without ever asking you? For most of my time at Northbridge Logistics, I was the person people came to when something stopped working. Not the kind of problem that required a meeting or a formal escalation. Those usually went to management. I handled the quieter problems, the spreadsheet formulas that suddenly broke on the last day of the month. The shipping schedule didn't match the warehouse inventory. The client reported that someone promised, but hadn't actually prepared yet. If something slipped through the cracks, it usually landed on my desk. And I didn't mind. In fact, for a long time, I took a certain pride in it. There's a kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you can walk into a complicated situation, look at it for 10 minutes, and understand exactly where the issue started. Operations are like that. It rewards patience more than charisma. You learn how systems connect to each other, how one small change can ripple through an entire process. Most people prefer the visible parts of a company, the presentations, the client calls, the strategic meetings. I've always been more comfortable with the invisible ones. My desk sat near the middle of our open office floor, not close enough to the windows to enjoy the view of the Seattle waterfront, but not hidden in the back either. It was the kind of spot people passed by constantly, which meant people stopped by constantly too. Grace, quick question. Grace, do you remember how we handled the Carter shipment last quarter? Grace, could you look at this for a second? Sometimes the questions were small, sometimes they were entire projects disguised as quick favors. But over time, something interesting happened. People stopped asking who should solve a problem. They just assumed I would. Even my manager, Daniel Whitaker, fell into that pattern. Daniel wasn't a bad manager, at least not in the obvious ways. He didn't yell, he didn't micromanage. He mostly let people do their jobs, which worked well for someone like me. If a client issue surfaced, Daniel would appear at my desk with that familiar half smile. "Grace, you're good with this kind of thing," he'd say. Could you take a look? And I would, not because he ordered me to, but because I knew if I didn't, the problem would simply grow until someone else handled it badly. The strange part is that none of this was officially my responsibility. On paper, my title was Senior Operations Analyst. In practice, I had gradually become something closer to a quiet coordinator, the person who understood how the moving pieces fit together. The team leads would handle the formal decisions, managers would approve budgets and strategy, but the day-to-day mechanics, the small adjustments that kept everything moving, often passed through me first. I didn't announce it, and nobody officially assigned it. It just evolved that way. There's a certain type of workplace role that forms naturally when someone is reliable long enough. You become the person others lean on. At first, it feels like trust. Then it becomes expectation. And eventually, something else, invisibility. Because when someone always solves problems calmly, people begin to forget the effort involved. They stop seeing the work. They only see the outcome. By my third year at Northbridge, I had trained 2 junior analysts, helped redesign part of our vendor reporting system, and quietly built a set of internal guides that most of the department used without realizing where they came from. I kept those notes in the same navy leather notebook I carried to every meeting. That notebook had been with me since my first week at the company. Its pages held diagrams of workflows, reminders about client preferences, and little observations I'd written down over the years. It wasn't anything official, just my way of keeping things organized. Sometimes during meetings, I would glance around the room and notice something subtle. When someone asked a technical question, people often turned toward me without thinking. Not Daniel, not the team leads, me, but interestingly, that silent recognition never seemed to extend beyond the room. Outside those meetings, the structure of the company remained exactly the same. Titles mattered, hierarchy mattered, and I was still, on paper, the analyst supporting everyone else's work. At the time, I didn't question it very much. I told myself the same thing a lot of capable people tell themselves. Eventually, the work will speak for itself. Eventually, someone will notice. Eventually, the formal role will match the responsibilities you're already carrying. Looking back now, I realized something important. The people around me did notice the work. They just interpreted it differently. To them, my reliability didn't signal leadership. It signaled something much simpler, that I would always be there to handle things quietly, no matter who received the credit. And for a long time, I allowed that assumption to remain unchallenged. The first real hint that this quiet arrangement had limits came in such a small moment that almost everyone else in the room forgot it immediately. But I didn't. Because sometimes the first sign of a much bigger pattern appears as something almost invisible. Just a sentence, a tone, a brief pause in a meeting that tells you exactly how people see you. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The moment happened during a Tuesday morning operations meeting. Nothing dramatic, just the usual group around the conference table. Daniel at the head, 2 team leads on the left, 3 analysts, including me, along the right side. Coffee cups, laptops, the low hum of people half listening while scrolling through email. We were reviewing a shipment delay involving one of our larger retail clients. The warehouse logs showed one thing. The vendor system showed another. And the client's tracking data showed something completely different. For about 10 minutes, the conversation circled the same confusion. One of the team leads suggested contacting the warehouse again. Another thought the vendor system might simply be lagging. Daniel leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen lightly against the table. Finally, he said, "Does anyone actually know what happened here?" There was a brief pause. Then almost automatically, several people glanced in my direction. It wasn't dramatic or coordinated. Just a small shift of attention, the kind that happens when people instinctively expect someone to have the answer. I had already looked into the issue earlier that morning. While everyone else was still arriving at the office, I'd noticed the discrepancy in the system alerts. 10 minutes of digging through the shipment logs had made the problem pretty clear. The vendor's automated scheduling tool had pushed the delivery window forward by 6 hours, but the warehouse had continued loading according to the original schedule. 2 systems, both technically correct, working on different timelines. A classic operations problem. So I explained it, calmly, step by step, where the delay started. Why did the system show conflicting data? What adjustment needed to happen to prevent it next time? While I spoke, Daniel nodded slowly, the way managers do when they're absorbing something useful. When I finished, the room was quiet for a second. Then Daniel turned to one of the team leads. Okay, he said, why don't you coordinate with the vendor and make sure they correct the automation rule? The team lead nodded. Will do. And that was it. The meeting moved on. No one questioned the explanation. No one asked for clarification. The solution simply folded into the next agenda item as if it had appeared naturally out of the room. At the time, I barely reacted. That pattern had happened before. You explain the problem. Someone else implements the decision. It didn't feel personal. It just felt normal. But a few minutes later, something smaller happened, something that lingered in my mind much longer than the shipment issue itself. Near the end of the meeting, Daniel summarized the discussion. So, he said, it sounds like we've identified the scheduling mismatch. Good catch noticing that early. His eyes moved briefly around the table. Then they settled on the team lead, who had agreed to contact the vendor. Thanks for jumping on that. The team lead gave a small smile. Of course. I remember looking down at my notebook in that moment, not out of disappointment exactly, more out of curiosity, because the room had just quietly rewritten what happened. Everyone knew where the explanation came from. They had looked at me when the question was asked. They had listened while I walked through the system conflict. But by the time the meeting ended, the solution belonged to someone else, and what surprised me most was how easily the shift happened. No one corrected it. No one clarified it. Not even me. I simply wrote a few notes in my Navy notebook and closed it. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing at all, just a routine meeting. But later that afternoon, while I was reviewing vendor logs, I caught myself replaying that small moment in my head, not with anger, just awareness. Because once you notice a pattern, you start seeing earlier versions of it everywhere. Conversations where you did the groundwork, but someone else presented the conclusion. Projects where you handled the complicated parts while another person received the recognition. None of those moments had seemed important individually, but suddenly they felt connected, like small threads that had been quietly weaving together for years. At the time, I told myself something simple. It wasn't intentional. People weren't trying to dismiss me. They were just following the structure of the company. Titles guided attention. Authority shaped credit. And I didn't have the title that made people stop and say, that idea came from her. So I let the moment pass. What I didn't realize yet was that moments like that rarely stay small, because when a quiet kind of dismissal goes unchallenged long enough, it slowly becomes the default. After that meeting, nothing changed, which at the time felt reassuring. No tension, no awkward conversations, no sign that anything unusual had happened. The office returned to its normal rhythm almost immediately. Emails, vendor calls, shipping reports, the steady flow of small operational problems that quietly fill an analyst's day, and for a while, I convinced myself the meeting had meant very little. Workplaces are busy places. People move quickly from one issue to the next. Credit doesn't always land precisely where it started. That's normal. At least that's what I told myself. But over the next few months, the same pattern appeared again, and again, and again, never in a way dramatic enough to spark confrontation. Just small moments that stacked quietly on top of each other. A project update where my research notes became someone else's presentation slides. A client call where I explained the logistics solution, and Daniel later summarized it to the executive team as something the leadership group had decided. A process document I wrote that gradually started circulating around the department without my name attached. None of those things felt malicious. If anything, they felt efficient. The company moved quickly. People reused information wherever they could. Work flowed through the department like water through a network of pipes. And my role, it seemed, was to keep the pressure balanced. There's a strange psychological shift that happens when someone becomes known as reliable. At first, reliability earns appreciation. Then it earns dependence. And eventually, it quietly removes the need to acknowledge where the work originated. Because reliable people don't complain. Reliable people don't demand recognition. Reliable people simply keep the system running. That was the role I had gradually grown into. And without realizing it, I had started reinforcing it myself. When someone used my work without mentioning my name, I didn't correct them. When Daniel summarized my ideas in meetings without attribution, I didn't interrupt. When new analysts asked who created the internal guides they were using, I simply explained how the system worked. I never said, I built that. Part of it was personality. I've never been someone who enjoys drawing attention to herself. The work itself always mattered more to me than the spotlight around it. But another part of it was something quieter, rationalization. Each time a small moment happened, I explained it away in my own mind. This project is a team effort. Daniel probably just forgot. The outcome matters more than the credit. Those explanations weren't entirely wrong, but they also made it very easy for the pattern to continue. Because when you consistently absorb small dismissals without reacting, people stop noticing them altogether. They simply become part of the environment, like the hum of the air conditioner in the ceiling, always there, rarely acknowledged. One afternoon, a junior analyst named Marcus stopped by my desk with a question about the vendor reconciliation process. He had only been with the company for a few weeks, bright, enthusiastic, still trying to understand how everything connected. "Grace," he said, scrolling through a document on his laptop, "do you know who created this guide? It's really good." I leaned slightly toward the screen. It was the reconciliation workflow I had written nearly a year earlier. The formatting had changed a little. Someone had added a company logo to the header, but the structure, the explanations, even some of the exact sentences were unmistakably mine. Marcus continued, "I think management must have put a lot of thought into this." I smiled. "Something like that," I said. Then I walked him through the process step by step. The moment passed quickly. Marcus thanked me and returned to his desk. But after he left, I sat there for a minute longer than usual. Not upset, not even particularly frustrated, just thoughtful. Because that brief conversation revealed something interesting. To Marcus, and probably to several others, the systems that kept the department functioning appeared to come from somewhere above, from leadership, from management, not from the quiet analyst sitting near the center of the office. And I realized something else too. For 3 years, I had allowed that perception to grow without challenging it. Not because I lacked the opportunity, but because correcting it never felt necessary. Until slowly, the role everyone expected from me became clearer, reliable, helpful, capable, but ultimately, supportive. The person who kept things running, not the person who led them. At the time, I still believed that would eventually change, that the work would accumulate, that someone, Daniel perhaps, would eventually connect the dots. What I didn't yet understand was that roles, once established quietly enough, rarely change on their own. They solidify, they settle, and eventually everyone begins acting as if they had always been that way, including the person inside them. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, the way certain truths do, through repetition. The same patterns appear in slightly different situations until eventually you can't pretend they're coincidences anymore. By the beginning of my 3rd year at Northbridge, something about my position in the department had quietly solidified. I had become the person who made things work, but not the person who officially owned them. The difference is subtle if you look at it from the outside, but inside an organization, that distinction shapes almost everything. When a new project started, the team leads discussed the strategy. Daniel reviewed timelines and budgets. Then someone would say something like, "Grace can help us figure out the process details." And I would. I mapped out workflows, I flagged potential risks, I created the documentation that everyone would later reference when problems appeared. In many ways, I enjoyed that part of the work. Operations is fundamentally about structure, understanding how pieces interact so the system runs smoothly. But gradually, I noticed that my involvement always followed the same rhythm. I entered the conversation after the main decisions were made, not because I wasn't capable of contributing earlier, but because that's where my role had been placed: support, clarification, stability, never authorship. There was one meeting in particular that made this especially clear. Daniel had gathered the department to discuss improvements to our vendor coordination process. The company was growing quickly, and the old system was starting to show cracks. During the discussion, several suggestions were tossed around, some practical, some less so. At one point, Daniel looked in my direction. "Grace," he said casually, "you've worked with these systems the most. What do you think?" I explained that the main issue wasn't vendor response time, which everyone seemed focused on. The real problem was that our internal reporting tools didn't sync properly with the vendor platform. That mismatch created delays that looked like vendor errors, but actually originated inside our own system. I outlined a simple adjustment that could fix it. Not a complicated solution, just a structural correction that would eliminate several recurring delays. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Interesting, he said. Then he turned to one of the team leads. Why don't you take a look at that idea and see if we can integrate it into the new process? The team lead agreed, the meeting continued, and once again, the ownership of the idea drifted quietly away from where it started. That was the moment something clicked for me, not emotionally, but logically, because I suddenly understood something about the system I had been working inside. The department didn't see me as someone whose ideas needed to be attributed. They saw me as part of the mechanism, like a well-designed tool, reliable, useful, always available when needed. But tools don't receive credit for the work they enable. They simply make the work possible. And the strange part is that I had helped build that perception myself. I had never corrected anyone, never stepped forward to claim authorship, never interrupted a meeting to say, "That was my proposal." For years, I believed that kind of self-assertion would feel unnecessary, or worse, uncomfortable. But now I could see the other side of that choice. Silence leaves space. And when that space appears in professional environments, something always fills it. Usually hierarchy, usually titles, sometimes assumptions. Over time, people stopped wondering where certain ideas originated. They simply assumed they came from the people whose positions suggested authority. Managers, team leads, leadership, and I was none of those things. On paper, I was still the senior operations analyst supporting everyone else, reliable, consistent, quietly effective. Exactly the role the department expected me to play. What I didn't realize yet was that roles like that come with an invisible condition. As long as you remain inside them, people rarely question the structure, but the moment you step outside them, the entire system notices. At the time, though, I wasn't planning to step outside anything. Not yet, because the shift that changed everything didn't come from a meeting or a conversation. It happened on an ordinary afternoon when something small, almost trivial, revealed just how firmly my role had been defined. And once I saw it clearly, I couldn't pretend anymore that it was temporary. The shift happened on an ordinary afternoon. Daniel stopped by my desk with a proposal he was preparing for the director. As I read through it, I recognized most of the ideas immediately. They were solutions I had suggested in meetings over the past few months. Daniel asked if the workflow made sense. I pointed out one adjustment that would prevent a reporting delay. He nodded and thanked me. Then he took the proposal back to his office. The moment lasted less than 2 minutes. But as I returned to my work, something became very clear. The ideas were useful. My input was valued. But the ownership of those ideas had already moved somewhere else. That was the first time I stopped expecting the system to eventually notice. And once that expectation disappeared, something inside my thinking quietly changed. After that afternoon, I didn't change anything immediately, at least not in ways anyone else could see. I still arrived at the office around 8:30 most mornings. I still carried the same navy leather notebook into meetings. I still answered questions when coworkers stopped by my desk. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. But internally, something subtle had shifted. For years, my silence had come from a simple assumption. That recognition would eventually follow contribution. That the system, given enough time, would align things correctly. Once that belief disappeared, the silence remained. But it changed character. It stopped being passive and became deliberate. The difference between those two states is almost invisible to observers. When someone is quietly accommodating, people read it as personality. When someone is quietly observing, people rarely notice at all. The first small test happened a week later. During another operations meeting, Daniel asked about a recurring vendor discrepancy. It was a familiar issue, one I had already identified earlier that morning. Just like before, several people glanced in my direction. In the past, I would have explained the cause immediately, walked through the logic, clarified the solution, and smoothed the situation before it created confusion. But this time, I did something slightly different. I waited. Not long. Just long enough to see what would happen if I didn't fill the silence. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then one of the team leads offered a theory that didn't quite match the data. Another analyst suggested checking the warehouse logs again. Daniel frowned slightly, trying to piece together the explanations. Eventually he said, "Grace, do you have any thoughts?" I did. The same clear explanation I had discovered earlier. But I answered more simply than usual. I'd need to take a closer look, I said, which was technically true. I always preferred verifying things carefully. Daniel nodded. All right, let's revisit it later today. The meeting moved on. No one seemed particularly concerned about the delay. And for the first time in years, I noticed something interesting about the room. Without my immediate explanation, the conversation drifted longer than usual. People circled around partial ideas instead of moving directly toward a clear answer. Nothing catastrophic happened, but the smooth efficiency everyone had grown used to faded slightly. Over the next few weeks, I repeated that small adjustment in different situations. When coworkers asked quick questions that required deeper context, I sometimes suggested they check the documentation first. When someone referenced a process I had built, I didn't automatically clarify every detail, not out of pettiness, and not to create problems. I simply stopped instinctively carrying the entire structure on my own. The interesting part was how people interpreted the change. No one accused me of withholding information. No one questioned my professionalism. Instead, most people assumed the same thing they had always assumed. That Grace was busy, that Grace would get to it eventually, because reliability creates a powerful expectation. Even when the rhythm shifts slightly, people believe the outcome will remain the same. And for a while, it did. I still solved the problems that genuinely required my involvement. I still maintained the systems that would cause real damage if neglected. But I no longer rushed to fill every gap before others even noticed it existed. Instead, I started watching something I had rarely paid attention to before: the structure of dependency around me. Who relied on which processes? Which knowledge lived only in documentation? Which details existed mostly inside my head? It wasn't a formal project, more like quiet observation. Patterns are emerging slowly over time, and the more I observed, the clearer something became. For years, I had believed my value to the department came from being helpful. But helpfulness, I realized, is easy for organizations to overlook. What truly shapes a system is leverage, not a loud authority, not a dramatic influence, just the quiet places where knowledge, responsibility, and timing intersect. And as I watched the department operate without my constant intervention, I began to see exactly where those intersections were. Places no one else seemed to notice. Places where the smooth functioning of the system depended on details that had never been formally assigned, details I had been managing quietly for years. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. If anything, it made me feel thoughtful. Because once you recognize where leverage lives inside a system, you face a very specific choice. You can keep maintaining it exactly as before, or you can begin asking a different question entirely. Not, why doesn't anyone notice, but something far more practical. What would happen if I simply stopped holding everything together by myself? At the time, I didn't know the full answer yet, but I was beginning to understand where to look. The interesting thing about complex systems is that most people only see the parts they interact with: the dashboards, the reports, the meetings where decisions get made. Very few people pay attention to the quiet layers underneath: the small adjustments, the documentation, the relationships that keep everything aligned. For years, I had lived in those layers, and because I had always treated them as routine, I hadn't fully realized how much of the department's stability flowed through them. Once my perspective shifted, I started noticing those connections everywhere, not with urgency, just out of curiosity. For example, our vendor coordination process looked straightforward from the outside. A report generated each morning flagged delayed shipments. The operations team reviewed the data, then contacted the appropriate vendors. But that report didn't actually come from one system. It came from three: the warehouse logs, the vendor scheduling platform, and our internal reconciliation spreadsheet. Someone had to cross-check those data sources every day to make sure the automation hadn't created mismatches. Officially, the process was automated. In reality, I had been verifying the alignment quietly every morning for almost 2 years. Not because anyone asked me to, because the first time the automation failed, it caused a delay large enough to upset one of our biggest clients. After that, I built a small routine into my mornings: 10 minutes of verification before the rest of the department arrived. No one noticed. And because no one noticed, the system appeared perfectly stable. There were other things like that too. The internal documentation guides everyone relied on. The vendor contact notes that were in my notebook hadn't been fully transferred to the shared database. The way certain reporting formulas had to be adjusted each quarter was because the accounting system exported its numbers differently. None of those tasks was dramatic. They were small, routine, but together they formed something more significant than any single project. They formed continuity, the quiet thread that connected one week of operations to the next without disruption. For the first time, instead of simply maintaining those threads automatically, I started mapping them mentally. Which processes depended on undocumented knowledge? Which ones relied on habits I had built over time? Which systems were genuinely automated? And which ones only appeared that way because I quietly corrected them before anyone else saw the errors? This wasn't preparation for anything specific. I wasn't plotting a dramatic move or planning some elaborate strategy. I was simply paying attention to something I had overlooked for years, my own position inside the structure. One evening, about a month after that afternoon with Daniel, I stayed a little longer than usual. Most of the office had already left. The overhead lights were dimmer, and the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system filled the open floor. I opened my Navy notebook and flipped through its pages slowly. Process diagrams, vendor contacts, meeting notes from projects that had long since been completed. Each page represented some small improvement, some adjustment that made the department run more smoothly. And as I looked through them, a simple realization formed. Almost everything in that notebook had been created before anyone asked for it. Not assigned, not requested, just built quietly because I had seen a way to make things work better. At the time, I believed that kind of initiative would naturally translate into leadership eventually. Now I could see something different. Initiative doesn't always create authority. Sometimes it creates dependency. And dependency, if it remains invisible long enough, becomes part of the background, reliable, expected, unquestioned. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in a long while, I imagined something unusual. Not leaving the company, not confronting anyone, just stepping back, allowing the system to operate exactly as designed. Without the invisible adjustments I had been making for years, the thought wasn't satisfying. It wasn't dramatic. If anything, it felt strangely neutral, like observing a machine and wondering how it would behave if a few unseen gears stopped turning. Of course, I didn't act on that idea immediately. There was still something I needed first. Not confirmation of my value. I already understood that part. What I needed was clarity about something else entirely, because quiet leverage inside a system is one thing, but using it responsibly requires knowing exactly where it leads. And a few days later, during a routine review of vendor contracts, I discovered something that provided that clarity. Not a secret, not a scandal, just a small detail buried inside the company's operational agreements. A detail that revealed how much of the department's stability depended on knowledge that, technically, wasn't owned by the company at all. The discovery happened on a quiet Wednesday morning. I wasn't searching for anything unusual at the time. I was reviewing vendor agreements for a quarterly reconciliation project, something I did a few times each year to make sure our reporting procedures still matched the contractual terms. It was slow work. Most vendor contracts follow a predictable structure: service expectations, reporting timelines, escalation contacts, and renewal conditions. After a while, they begin to blur together, but one clause caught my attention. Not because it looked dramatic, because it looked familiar. The agreement referenced a custom reporting framework that Northbridge used to synchronize shipment data with the vendor's scheduling platform. That framework wasn't part of the vendor's standard system. It was listed as an internal operational process developed by the client organization. In other words, by us. Except that the description inside the contract wasn't quite accurate, because that reporting framework, the one our department relied on every single day, had never been formally developed by the company. I had built it, not as a project, not as an assigned responsibility, just gradually over time. It started 2 years earlier when the vendor's default reporting format created constant reconciliation errors. At first, I adjusted the spreadsheets manually to fix the mismatches. Then I created a small workflow guide so the corrections could be repeated easily. Eventually, those adjustments became the structure everyone used. Someone must have incorporated the process description into the vendor contract during a later update, probably assuming it came from our operations leadership. But the key detail wasn't the description itself, it was the ownership clause attached to it. The contract stated that the reporting framework belonged to the client organization as documented within its internal system, which meant the company officially owned whatever version of that framework existed in its formal documentation. But as I reviewed our internal knowledge base later that morning, something became very clear. The documentation was incomplete. The shared system described the broad workflow, but many of the small adjustments, the parts that prevented mismatches between the warehouse logs and the vendor scheduling platform, existed only in two places: my notebook and my daily routines. The company owned the framework, but the actual working version of that framework lived mostly inside my head. I sat with that realization for a while. Not an excitement, not an alarm, just quiet consideration, because technically nothing about the situation was unusual. Many experienced employees carry institutional knowledge that isn't perfectly documented. Systems evolve gradually, and the people maintaining them often understand details that never fully appear in formal guides. Organizations usually rely on that knowledge without thinking much about it, until the day it's suddenly missing. Still, I didn't feel any immediate sense of power from the discovery. If anything, I felt a certain calm, because for the first time, I could clearly see the difference between visible authority and operational leverage. Daniel had the authority, the title, the leadership position, but the stability of several important reporting systems relied on details he had never needed to understand. Not because he was incapable, simply because those details had always been handled quietly before they became problems, handled by me. I closed the contract file and leaned back slightly in my chair. Through the glass walls of the office, I could see Daniel speaking with one of the team leads near the conference room. They looked relaxed, confident, discussing next week's reporting improvements, the same improvements partially built on processes I had designed. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about something I had avoided considering before. Not what the company owed me. That kind of thinking rarely leads anywhere productive. But something more practical. What obligations did I actually have to maintain systems that had never officially been assigned to me? I had taken responsibility for them voluntarily, because I cared about the work, because I liked solving problems, because keeping the department running smoothly felt satisfying. But voluntary responsibilities can always be reevaluated, especially once you realize they were never truly acknowledged. I opened my notebook again and reviewed a few of the reporting steps I had written down months earlier. Small detail, verification habits, little corrections that kept the automation aligned. None of it is dramatic, but together, they prevented errors that could quietly ripple through the entire reporting chain. I closed the notebook gently, still calm, still thoughtful. The discovery didn't make me feel triumphant. It simply removed the last remaining uncertainty about something important. For years, I had wondered whether my quiet role in the department truly mattered. Now I understood exactly where that role intersected with the system itself. And once you understand where your leverage exists, you eventually arrive at a very specific moment. A moment where observation is no longer enough, where you have to decide something. Not emotionally, not impulsively, just clearly, because the system will continue functioning exactly as it always has, unless someone inside it chooses a different path. And a few days later, sitting at my desk with that same Navy notebook in front of me, I finally made that decision. The decision didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no late-night frustration, no emotional conversation with a friend telling me I deserved better. In fact, when it finally came, the office was almost completely quiet. It was early morning, about 20 minutes before most people arrived. The kind of calm time I had always liked best, when the building felt more like a library than a workplace. I opened my laptop, poured a cup of coffee, and looked over the vendor reporting dashboard. Everything was functioning normally. Shipment data synced overnight. Warehouse logs matched the scheduling platform. The reconciliation sheet was clean, exactly the kind of smooth morning the department had grown used to. For a moment, I simply watched the screen, not thinking about Daniel, not thinking about the promotion I expected might eventually come, just thinking about the system itself. For 3 years, I had quietly shaped the way this department operated. Not through authority, but through hundreds of small adjustments that prevented problems before anyone else noticed them. And until recently, I believed that was enough. That stability had value. That reliability would eventually translate into trust. but the conversation about the upcoming promotion had already started circulating through the office. I had heard fragments of it in the hallway, mentions of leadership restructuring, hints that Daniel was recommending someone with strong long-term potential. At the time, I still assumed the role might come to me, not because I demanded it, but because the responsibilities were already part of my daily work. Now, sitting there in the quiet of the early morning, I saw the situation differently, not emotionally. Structurally, because the system around me had already made a quiet decision about what role I represented. I was the person who kept things running, the person who would step in when others needed help, the person who understood the details but didn't claim the spotlight. And as long as I continued behaving that way, nothing about the structure would change. The promotion process would follow the same logic the company had always used. Titles would flow toward visible leadership, toward people positioned at the top of the hierarchy, not toward the quiet analyst in the center of the room who made the mechanics work. That realization didn't make me angry. It simply clarified my options. Option 1 was the path I had already been following. Continue maintaining everything quietly. Continue hoping the system would eventually recognize the work. Wait. Option 2 was more complicated. Not confrontation, no complaints, just a gradual withdrawal from the invisible responsibilities I had accumulated over the years. Allow the system to operate using only the processes that were officially assigned. Nothing more. No morning verification routines, no silent corrections to automation mismatches, no anticipating problems before they appear. Just the work that actually belonged to my job description. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't even resistance. It was simply alignment, matching my effort to the role the organization had formally given me. I closed the reporting dashboard and leaned back slightly in my chair. If I chose that path, the department wouldn't collapse overnight. Systems rarely fail that dramatically, but the smooth efficiency everyone had grown accustomed to might begin to shift. Small delays, confusion over documentation, problems that once disappeared quietly before anyone saw them might begin reaching the surface. And eventually, someone would need to address those changes. Maybe Daniel, maybe the new team leads, whoever ended up occupying that role. For a long moment, I sat there considering both possibilities. Then I opened my notebook, not to write anything dramatic, just to turn to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote a single line: operate within role boundaries. Nothing else, no explanation, no emotional notes, just a reminder. Because once I made that decision, the rest of the process would be simple. Not easy, but simple. From that point forward, I would still do my job well, still support my coworkers, still behave professionally. But the quiet layer of extra stability, the one I had built voluntarily for years, would no longer be my responsibility. And interestingly enough, when you remove something that people never realized existed, they rarely notice at first. After I made the decision, the most important thing was consistency, not speed, not drama, just quiet alignment between my responsibilities and my actions. From the outside, nothing about my behavior changed in any obvious way. I still arrived early most mornings. I still answered questions from coworkers. I still attended every meeting Daniel scheduled. But the small routines that had quietly supported the department for years began to fade. The first one was the morning verification check. For almost 2 years, I had spent 10 minutes each morning comparing the vendor scheduling platform with the warehouse shipment logs. It wasn't officially assigned to anyone. It was simply a habit I had built after an early automation error caused a client delay. That morning, I opened the reporting dashboard as usual, but instead of cross-checking the data sources, I reviewed only the reports that were officially assigned to my role. Then I closed the tab. Nothing happened immediately. The system still looked stable, and because the automation ran overnight, no one expected problems before the first shipment alerts appeared later in the day. The second adjustment involved documentation. Over time, I had accumulated dozens of small operational notes, things that made certain processes easier to manage, but had never been fully transferred into the company's shared knowledge base. In the past, whenever someone asked about a process detail, I would instinctively explain the missing pieces. Now, I simply pointed them toward the documentation that already existed. If the guide contained the answer, they found it. If it didn't, they usually assumed the system was working as intended. Again, nothing dramatic happened right away. The department still functioned. Reports still circulated. Meetings still followed their usual structure. But the friction inside the system began to change slightly. Small questions that once resolved instantly started taking longer. People revisited documentation more often. Occasionally, someone sent a message asking if anyone understood why a particular report looked different from the previous week. Most of the time, someone else would suggest a theory, and the conversation would move on. About 2 weeks into this quiet shift, Daniel stopped by my desk again. "Grace," he said, holding a printed report, "have you noticed anything unusual with the vendor sync times lately?" His tone was casual, curious, not concerned. I looked over the report briefly. "Yes," I said, "there have been a few inconsistencies." Daniel frowned slightly. "Do you know what's causing them?" I paused just long enough to remain honest. "I haven't investigated yet," I said, which was true, because the verification routine that once caught those inconsistencies early was no longer part of my mornings. Daniel nodded. "All right, let me know if you spot anything." Of course. He returned to his office. The interaction lasted less than a minute. And that was the pattern that defined the next several weeks. Small anomalies surfaced occasionally, nothing severe enough to trigger an immediate alarm. But the quiet efficiency the department had grown used to began to feel less predictable, not broken, just slightly uneven. Meanwhile, conversations about the upcoming team lead promotion continued drifting through the office. People speculated about candidates. Some assumed the role would go to one of the existing team leads. Others believed Daniel might bring in someone new. I rarely joined those discussions, not because I felt excluded, simply because my attention had shifted elsewhere. Instead of wondering who might receive the title, I found myself observing how the department adapted when certain invisible supports disappeared, which processes remained stable, which ones struggled, and which details people began noticing for the first time. Because systems, like people, often reveal their structure most clearly when something small changes. And although no one understood it yet, the structure of our department was already beginning to shift, quietly, gradually, exactly the way most real changes happen. The first real sign appeared about 3 weeks later, not in a meeting, not in a report, in an email. It arrived mid-morning from one of our larger retail clients. The subject line read, "Shipment timing discrepancy." That kind of message wasn't unusual. Operations always involve small timing issues between warehouses, vendors, and transportation schedules, but this one was slightly different. The client's shipment had been loaded according to the warehouse schedule, while the vendor platform still showed the earlier delivery window. The mismatch created a delay that forced the transportation team to reroute the shipment later in the day. Not a disaster, but inconvenient enough for the client to ask questions. Normally, an issue like that would have been resolved quietly before it reached anyone outside the department. The morning verification routine, the one I had stopped doing, usually caught those scheduling mismatches before the report circulated. Now the mismatch had traveled a little further through the system before anyone noticed. Daniel forwarded the email to the team with a short note. "Can someone take a look at this?" The message appeared in our shared channel a few minutes later. One of the team leads began reviewing the warehouse logs. Another analyst checked the vendor platform. For a while, the conversation moved slowly as people compared pieces of information that didn't quite align. I watched the discussion from my desk, not detached, just observant, because for the first time in a long while, the department was encountering a problem without the shortcut it had quietly relied on before. Eventually, Marcus, the junior analyst who had asked about my documentation months earlier, walked over to my desk. "Grace," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "do you know why the vendor schedule would shift after the warehouse confirmation?" I knew the answer almost immediately. The vendor platform's automation rule was still adjusting delivery windows based on outdated synchronization settings. It had been happening occasionally for years, but the morning verification check usually corrected the data before anyone noticed. Now the correction hadn't happened, so the error had surfaced. But instead of explaining the entire situation the way I would have before, I simply said, "It could be a sync issue between the two systems." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." He returned to his desk and shared that idea with the team. A few hours later, the discrepancy was resolved. Someone contacted the vendor platform support team and manually updated the shipment record. Problem solved. But the interesting part wasn't the solution. It was the time it took to reach it. In the past, that issue would have been identified and corrected before the first client email arrived. Now it had traveled through several layers of discussion first. Still manageable, still professional, but slightly slower. And once something like that happens, people rarely think much about it. They assume it was an isolated situation. A few days later, another small irregularity appeared. This time, it involved a reporting summary that didn't match the warehouse totals. Then the following week, a vendor reconciliation report showed minor discrepancies that required extra review. Each issue was small, each one eventually resolved. But gradually, the department's rhythm began to change. Meetings took a little longer. More questions appeared in shared channels. People revisited documentation that had previously felt straightforward. No one described the situation as a problem. If anything, most people treated it as normal operational complexity, but the quiet stability that once smoothed those details had faded, and the absence of that stability had a subtle effect on the entire department. Not panic, just friction. Meanwhile, the conversation about the team lead promotion finally reached its conclusion. Daniel scheduled a department meeting late Friday afternoon, the kind of meeting that signals an announcement. Everyone gathered in the conference room, laptops closed, coffee cups in hand. Daniel stood near the front of the room, with the relaxed expression managers often wear when sharing good news. "Thanks for coming, everyone," he said. "I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the team lead position we've been discussing." The room quieted. People exchanged small glances, some curious, some expectant. Then Daniel smiled. "We've decided to bring someone in who we believe has strong long-term leadership potential." There was a brief pause. Then he added, "He'll be joining us on Monday." Another short pause. "And some of you may recognize the last name." Daniel's smile widened slightly. "His name is Evan Whitaker." The room stayed silent for a moment, and then someone asked the question everyone was already thinking. "Whitaker, as in?" Daniel nodded casually. "My nephew." No one said anything else out loud, but in that moment, the entire structure of the past few months suddenly became much clearer. Because the system that had quietly shaped my role for years was about to introduce someone who would officially inherit it, without ever realizing how much of it had never been written down. Evan started the following Monday. He was polite, eager, and clearly trying to understand how the department worked. That same afternoon, he came to my desk with a notebook. "Daniel said you know the systems best," he said. "Could you walk me through the reporting workflow?" I opened the company documentation and showed him the official process. He read it carefully. Then he asked the question most new managers eventually ask. "Are there any details that aren't written here?" I answered simply. "The documentation shows the official workflow." Evan nodded and thanked me. Over the next few weeks, small issues began appearing more often. Reports needing extra review, timing mismatches between systems, and questions about processes that seemed incomplete. Nothing dramatic, just enough friction that people started noticing the difference. And by the time the department began asking why things suddenly required more effort, the answer had already become obvious. The system itself hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was how much invisible work was quietly holding it together. The conversation happened about 6 weeks after Evan joined the team. By then, the difference in the department's rhythm had become noticeable. Nothing dramatic, no crisis, but small problems were taking longer to resolve. Reports required extra checks. Meetings stretched further than they used to. Eventually, Daniel asked me to step into a small meeting room. Evan was already there with his laptop open. Daniel closed the door and sat down. "We've been looking at some of the reporting inconsistencies," he said. "Nothing major, but we want to understand why they're happening more often." Evan turned the laptop toward me. A reconciliation report filled the screen. "I feel like there are steps missing from the documentation," he said. "Things people used to do that aren't written down." Daniel looked at me. "Grace, you've worked with these systems longer than anyone. Is there something we're missing?" I glanced at the report for a moment. Then I answered calmly, "The documentation reflects the official process." Evan hesitated. "I heard you used to check the system every morning," he said. "Something about syncing the warehouse and vendor data." "Yes," I said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You were doing manual checks?" "Verification," I replied. "The automation sometimes created small timing mismatches. I used to correct them before the report circulated." Evan looked surprised. "That would explain most of the discrepancies we've been seeing." Daniel asked the obvious question. "Why did that stop?" I met his eyes. Because it wasn't part of my assigned responsibilities. The room went quiet for a few seconds. Not tense, just thoughtful. Daniel exhaled slowly. I didn't realize you were handling that. I never raised it formally, I said. Evan closed the laptop halfway. Would you be willing to show me how you used to do it? He asked. I answered honestly. The general process is already in the documentation. The rest came from experience. Daniel nodded after a moment. All right, he said quietly. Then we'll need to rebuild the system properly. I nodded as well. I'm sure you will. The meeting ended without arguments or raised voices. Just a quiet recognition that something important had been invisible for a long time. And once people finally see something that was hidden, they rarely forget it. A few months later, the department had adjusted. Evan slowly rebuilt parts of the reporting process. Some of the morning verification steps eventually became official procedures. New documentation appeared in the system. Things worked again. Not exactly the same way as before, but well enough. As for me, my role remained exactly what it said on paper. Senior operations analyst, but internally something had changed. I no longer tried to quietly carry responsibilities that no one had asked for. I still did my work well, I still helped when it was appropriate. But the invisible layer, the one built from assumptions and unspoken expectations, was gone. And interestingly, once I stopped trying to prove my value through silent effort, I felt lighter, more precise, more intentional about where my energy went. I didn't leave the company, I didn't confront anyone again. I simply became someone who understood exactly where her role began and where it ended. And sometimes that kind of clarity is its own quiet form of leadership. Looking back, I don't see the situation as a victory or a loss. It was simply a lesson about something many workplaces quietly teach without saying it out loud. If you consistently carry more responsibility than your role requires, people may appreciate it. But they may also begin to assume it's simply part of the background. And once something becomes background, it's rarely questioned. What changed my experience wasn't confrontation, it was clarity. Understanding the difference between helping and holding the entire system together alone. After that, the work felt different, more balanced, more honest, and in a quiet way, more sustainable. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where you were doing far more than your title suggested, and no one seemed to notice? I'd really like to hear your story in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.